Neuroscientist, psychiatrist, advisor, and author of The Source, Open Your Mind, Change Your Life, works with companies and individuals worldwide to achieve mental resilience and peak brain performance. An advocate for cognitive diversity and its rewards, my colleague Liesl Wilson caught up with Dr. Tara Swart to chat about the merging of science and spirituality and how neuroscience can empower women.
So I think I just want to start off by looking at the different dimensions of women empowerment. I mean, there's political, there's psychosocial, there's economic. But ultimately, in defining what women empowerment looks like from your perspective as a neuroscientist and psychiatrist, how would you encompass and describe that?
So from my lenses, as you said, there are a few. I have a PhD in neuroscience. I went to medical school and specialized in psychiatry. So although I understand that this is all in the context of geopolitical and psychosocial issues and crises, I tend to focus very much on the psychological and the neuroscientific. And so from that point of view, it's about breaking down a lot of stereotypes, maybe, the sort of narratives that we grow up with in society about what girls can do and can't do. I'm definitely a massive, passionate advocate of women empowerment, but I'm also an advocate of all sorts of everyone, but particularly minorities going into STEM subjects, so science, technology, maths and engineering. I particularly believe that education is power, and so I'm really passionate about education for women.
Dr. Swart, what is a really practical way that women can do to empower each other at large?
That's really interesting because I've tried everything. I've tried mentoring. I've tried being part of a supervision group. I've had coaching. I've had therapy, and I think everybody should have those things. But the one that I found was a real women empowerment one, and actually it doesn't have to be just for women, but in my case it was when I was starting up my business. There was another woman who was starting up a similar business, and she said, "Let's form a tribe." So we agreed to do this, and she said, okay, I'll invite one person and you invite one person, and then we'll let each person invite one person so that everybody knows someone, but we also get access to new people that we don't know. And so in the end, we had this tribe of 9, and we were together for about 2 years as we built our businesses, and we supported each other through things like engagement, marriage, pregnancy, building the business, changing direction. We had creative people, we had coaches. So that was such a valuable thing to do. And I think, for us, obviously, luckily, there wasn't any sort of insecure or dangerous or violent situation. But I think if you are potentially in a situation like that, then having other women that you could go to if you really needed help it gives you that choice of knowing when is enough in a situation that you might feel stuck.
I wanted to touch on the point of you incorporating science into, the work that you do, ultimately knowing that you've got the debate between spirituality, religion, and also science at large. So going through your work and dabbling in both sides, I mean, how have you come to redefine that narrative and how both factors work together?
So actually that story itself has quite a big learning in it, which is that growing up with parents from India, but I grew up in London.
Yes.
I felt that there were practices that happened at home, like yoga and meditation, that were not what all of my friends at school, were used to. So I kind of learnt how to keep these things very separate. And then as I realized that, I was good at science and I wanted to become a doctor, there was even more of a conflict at home between Eastern and Western medicine. And, I know that in South Africa it doesn't have to be a conflict, that's the end of the story, but there are differences in opinion between spiritual healing and, modern medicine. So I became very good at keeping those things separate. And it was only really when yoga became cool and all of my English friends were doing it that I sort of, I started doing that and I loved it, and I was a natural at it. Of course, I'd seen it growing up, but I'd kind of rejected it because it didn't really fit with how I wanted to, fit into my normal life with my friends. And so when I started having these ideas about the laws of attraction and visualization and vision boards, and a lot of the sort of Eastern and African philosophies that I personally secretly liked, but didn't ever talk about in my scientific work. And when I started to do the research for this book about, well, how much of this stuff can be backed up by cognitive science, by modern scanning technologies, it was like 90% of it was obviously aligned. We're just saying that they don't come together, but actually, if you think about something like visualization, it's all about what you see with your brain and how you imprint it on your subconscious. Or if you think about meditation, we know that it physically changes the structure of the brains. It lowers the stress hormones in the body. It changes the wave states in the brain. So I felt, okay, I can write this book because it kind of makes sense. But the thing that happened that I couldn't have predicted or tried to make it happen is that once the book came out, it like became something of its own, and everybody was so taken by this mixture of science and spirituality and completely accepted it. And so that really helped me to feel confident about the fact that that was an okay thing to do. So I think it resolved a lot of childhood dilemmas for me. But I did a podcast with this guy in America who said to me, you're a professor at the best university in the world, and it's the Massachusetts Institute of Technologies. It's a very scientific, technological university. He said, weren't you afraid that you were taking a risk by writing about visualization and laws of attraction? And it hadn't really crossed my mind because fearlessness is one of my values, and that's one of the values that I'd love more women to actually take on and, have as a very outspoken value. But then when he said that, I thought, yeah, I guess it was a risk, but it's 1,000,000% paid off because I wrote it in a way that made sense to people. But I think in people's hearts and souls, it made sense. Of course, our physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual health, or wealth, if you like to call it, is all, it should be aligned. These things can't be out of keeping with each other.
Yeah. And I mean, it's, as you said, it's easy to have words on paper, but you can't control how it resonates and what it evokes in people. And so much so that you also advocate some tips, I mean, in terms of rewiring cognitive biases, prejudices, stereotypes, etc. So looking at the societal context we find ourselves in 2020, the world over, we're seeing that hashtag Black and White challenge that stems from Turkey. You've got the Black Lives Movement. You've got, as I mentioned, the high GBV and femicide rates in South Africa. I mean, how does one ultimately go about reworking those narratives into narratives that empower us and also allow us to mutually benefit from the outlook?
I mean, I've actually done a TEDx talk on neuroscience and nationalism, and nationalism was the safe word to use, but since the Black Lives Matter movement, I've released it again and said it is about racism. Basically, nobody likes to use that word, but when you use the science to explain that regardless of our color or our gender or any of our preferences, we all have these biases wired into our brains, but we can choose to override them. That lays no blame at anybody's feet, and it gives us all a chance to make that good choice. To be honest, I felt ashamed that growing up in the UK, I didn't even really know what apartheid was till I was well into adulthood, but I made sure that I learned about it really quickly. And what I see in South Africa is the most beautiful things in the world and the ugliest things in the world. And so I feel like there are really bad things that happened. There are ways of thinking that people still have, but there is a choice. And there are those moments of beauty that there's so much hope. That's what I feel, but we all have to do something differently to just the way that we've got ingrained into doing it and assuming that people are against us or don't want good things for us. I think at the end of the day, we're all human. We know from a neuroscience point of view that if all your listeners, if I couldn't see them, but I could just see their brains on chairs, then just by very small things, because I'm a medical doctor and a neuroscientist, I could probably have quite a good guess, is this a male or a female brain? But I wouldn't be right 100% of the time. Well, women are smaller, so they have smaller skulls, but their grey matter is more densely packed into that small space. So, clearly, as a female neuroscientist, I'm allowed to say that. But there's nothing about a human brain that could tell you what the colour of that person's skin was. Nothing. There's no differences. So we experience the same emotions. We all want the same security out of life. And personally, I believe that love and trust are the answer. And this is coming from science as well as personal. Like, to be honest, I believe that the more mixed race relationships there are, or mixed race friendships in South Africa, the more people are it's going to be personal. It's not going to be about just tribal groups from evolution that happened millions of years ago. We need to talk to strangers. We need to talk to people who we wouldn't normally talk to. Eat foods that we wouldn't normally eat. Just learn from people's different life experiences. And I think, one of the great areas of hope for South Africa is how multilingual people are. So, for example, in the States, that is another barrier to people mixing, because people don't speak many languages, and so groups can be segregated along just language lines. And, I learned in South Africa that when you meet someone, it's respectful for you to speak to them in their language if you can. And I just think that's so beautiful. So, like I said, I know that some of the worst atrocities in history have happened in South Africa, but I also think there's nowhere that more beautiful things have happened, and it's a choice that you can make every day.
You speak about the plasticity of the brain in some of your works, and you also speak about the imposter syndrome that women in particular seem to experience. So for those who don't know what imposter syndrome is, perhaps how it affects women more so than men, how did you combine science with lived experience to unpack this, and how do we actually rework that narrative?
Okay, so two interesting things here. One is that neuroplasticity is the most exciting thing that's happened in modern neuroscience research. Like in the last 2 decades, we've seen how much the adult brain can change. We know that children's brains change a lot, like they learn to walk and talk in the first 2 years. There's just such massive rapid growth and learning, and even throughout the teenage years there's a lot of pruning, and it just sophisticates the brain for adulthood. Even in adulthood, you can do many things to keep your brain plastic and flexible. It's all about new learning, and it has to be quite intense learning, so that actually changes the structure of your brain. Things like crosswords and Sudoku isn't really enough, but I grew up bilingual with an Indian language. I learned French at school, but I learned Afrikaans at the age of 25. I tried to learn as much Zulu as I could, but I didn't really have much of an opportunity to practice it. But I think bringing some new learning into your life each year is important, and it doesn't have to be formal learning like a language or a musical instrument. It can be something cultural. It can be something, it can be to do with cooking, or just like, socializing with different types of people, or traveling. So that's really important.
Yeah. Well, they always say we don't know how far the ripple effects of our decisions go. But you've clearly penned thoughts to paper, and it's resonating with the rest of the world. You're advocating for equality, equity, inclusive growth, which gives us all agency and power at large. Thank you for telling your story, and thank you for joining us here on Weekend Dawn today.
Thank you so much, Liesl.
And that was Dr. Tara Swart, neuroscientist and author, chatting about how neuroscience can empower women, talking to our very own Liesl Wilson.